Welcome to Box Art Versus, the series where I compare video game box art across Japan, Europe and US to see how they stack up. In this episode we're taking a look at those from the PS2, one of the best consoles ever made, that was home to some of the most iconic games of all time. Let's start off with possibly the most famous example of regional differences in gaming box art that I have no doubt some of you will be familiar with, Ico. Both the Japanese and European versions share the same cover, which has a very painting-like appearance, and that's no coincidence, because it was inspired by a famous painting called The Nostalgia of the Infinite. It's not a perfect cover by any means, I can see it not catching a lot of people's eye, but it does fit the tone of the game and has an air of mysteriousness about it. Well, the US version said to hell with that and produced quite possibly one of the worst covers of all time, slapping an ugly CGI render of the main character front and centre with a stick, like he's about to bludgeon an old lady. Is it any wonder the original release flopped in the US? I don't think so. It's no secret I'm a huge fan of JRPGs, and back in 2006 there were few that could compare to Persona 3, which expertly mixes together turn-based combat and live sim. The original release of Persona 3 has 3 covers. The European one has Tartarus in the background with 4 of the party members. It's nice, even if the poses are a little generic. The US cover in comparison uses white silhouettes, which looks pretty lifeless, and the random placement doesn't do it any favours. I wouldn't really know what to expect looking at this cover in a store. Of course, the Japanese cover knocks it out of the park with something far more artistic, with the persona Thanatos looming over the main character. None are outright terrible, but the Japanese version is by far the best. Moving on to another JRPG, we have Final Fantasy XII. For quite a while, the Final Fantasy series was known for its simplistic box art in Europe and Japan, with just a white backdrop and the logo. And that's exactly what we got for Final Fantasy XII. It might not give much of the game away, but it's iconic and stylish. In the US, they were obviously concerned the simplistic box art wasn't marketable enough, as they got a cover that features the main cast and a fleet of sky pirates in the background. So we have 2 very different takes, and while the US one is a little more cliche, I actually think they both look pretty good in their own ways. I can see why someone would prefer one over the other. Ratchet and Clank 2 is a game I have a huge amount of nostalgia for, and also happens to be a fantastic example of old school box art differences that extends beyond just the artwork. In the US, the game was given the double entendre subtitle of Going Commando, with the box art showing Ratchet blast through a wall with a mini rocket cannon. In Europe, the game's title was changed to Locked and Loaded, likely to remove the sexual connotations of the US version. Stylistically, they aren't too dissimilar. Ratchet is wielding the Plasma Storm alongside wearing different armour, and his appearance is less aggressive. But overall, the framing and positioning is very comparable. In Japan, however, the game's artwork is extremely different, going for a more playful anime cartoon aesthetic that was no doubt in an effort to appeal to a more Japanese crowd. You also notice in Japan that Ratchet was given big bushy black eyebrows. Both the European and US covers look pretty good, but the US retains what I see as a real name and has a slightly more dynamic appearance, which works better. Metal Gear Solid 3 Snake Eater is one of the best games on the PS2 and has 3 covers. The Japanese and European covers are pretty similar. Both feature the series' iconic artwork by Yoji Shinkawa. The only real difference between them is the colour scheme of the artwork, and the European version featuring only Snake. The US one for the most part throws the iconic stylistic artwork out of the window, with Snake ready to strike behind a tree that at the very least does give some idea of what to expect from the gameplay. In comparison to the other 2, it features a much more impactful colour scheme. The fiery red gives a more hellscape aesthetic that is eye-catching, but ultimately less memorable. All of them have their merits, but the European version is arguably the most striking. 2006's Okami drew a ton of inspiration from Zelda to great effect. With such a heavy emphasis on Japanese culture, you might assume the Japanese box art would be significantly better than the Western version, but that's not the case. The Japanese version features a cherry blossom backdrop, but could easily be misinterpreted for just a grunge texture. The art does feature Amaterasu, but his placement feels like an afterthought as you're just precariously placed in the bottom left. The US and European cover, on the other hand, really nails the water painting aesthetic. Amaterasu's placement and pose works significantly better, and the backdrop has a great mural-like effect. Neither of these really compare to the HD remaster box art though, which is artistic, vibrant, and eye-catching. I'm sure many of you will be familiar with Resident Evil 4. Not only is it arguably the most well-known in the series, it's also just had an incredible remake on the current gen consoles. RE4 came to the PS2 almost a year after its original release on the GameCube with 3 covers. The US and Japanese version share quite similar tones. Leon is holding an action pose in both, but the Japanese version chooses to highlight Ashley and Ada, while the US version highlights the horror aspect. The US one isn't anything special by any means, but definitely gives a greater sense of the game's tone. The European version, on the other hand, is really something quite special. Leon is nowhere to be seen, you just get this really eerie blood-red forest with the Chainsaw Man in the distance, which does a fantastic job of capturing the horror, which, fun fact, is wholly responsible for why 13-year-old me never touched the game at the time of its release. For comparison's sake, here is the remake's cover, which I actually really like. And finally, we finish with Shadow of the Colossus, which was also made by the same devs who made Eco. There are 3 box arts for this one, with some interesting differences, and thankfully the US version isn't terrible. For the Japanese version, we get a back view of one of the Colossus shrouded in darkness being chased by the main character Wanda. Much like Eco's Japanese cover, it gives an air of mysteriousness about it. The Western covers, on the other hand, are extremely similar. Both have the Colossus facing Wanda almost in the same pose, although in the European version, Wanda is in a much more animated, ready-to-fight stance. Rather than a brown filter, it features a green filter much like the Japanese version. Interestingly, the PS4 remake's cover features the Colossus facing away, much like the original Japanese cover. So there you have it, a quick rundown of some regional differences of classic PS2 box art. Be sure to let me know which region you think had the best ones. That's it for this video. If you enjoyed it, be sure to leave a like, subscribe and hit the bell icon for a notification each time I upload new content. Thanks for watching, and I'll speak to you in the next video.